A billionaire standing protectively in front of his massive white G-Wagon froze in shock when a girl in tattered, ragged clothes sprinted through a dusty village market and threw herself at his waist, screaming, "Daddy!" He had never seen her before in his life, yet her desperate eyes told a story he wasn't prepared to hear. What he discovered next will shock you. Augustine was a billionaire not by inheritance or luck, but by sheer brilliance. A master of mechanical engineering, he rose to fame years ago after inventing a revolutionary engine prototype that changed the industry forever. That single invention opened doors to global real estate, finance, and oil, turning him into a man whose name carried weight in the world's financial capitals. Today, Augustine owns properties from Lagos to London and maintains a fleet of luxury vehicles, including the pristine white SUV he travels in today. Despite his immense success, Augustine didn't care for the fame. All he cared about was expansion, building his empire, and owning more. He lived a life behind a polished, quiet exterior, hiding the silent weight of a betrayal from his youth, a time when he chose his career over the woman he loved. On a sweltering afternoon, Augustine decided to personally inspect a new development site at a chaotic roadside junction. He arrived in his usual high-class style, a clean white suit, his driver in front, and a team of security scanning the busy market stalls. He had barely stepped out of his white G-Wagon to begin his inspection when the world he had carefully built began to crumble. "Daddy, Daddy, please help me." Everyone turned as 7-year-old Anna, wearing faded, rough clothes, ran full speed toward him. Before his security could react, she clung tightly to his waist with an emotional and desperate grip, her face wet with tears of fear. Behind her, a vengeful merchant approached with a wooden stick, screaming about a broken egg. Augustine looked down at the sharp-witted girl and felt a sudden haunting familiarity in her eyes that his billions could not ignore. If you're just tuning into this channel, please subscribe, give this video a thumbs up, and don't forget to share with your friends and family, and tell us where you're watching from in the comments section. Augustine stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse office, the skyline of Lagos shimmering like scattered diamonds below him. To the world, he was the gold standard of success, a self-made titan who had clawed his way from a brilliant mechanical engineer to a billionaire with interests spanning oil, gas, and high finance. His hands, once stained with the grease of prototype engines, now adjusted a silk tie that cost more than a family's annual rent. Yet, as he watched his private jets prepare for departure on the tarmac in the distance, the hollow ache in his chest remained untouched by his billions. His empire was built on a foundation of iron and a single haunting secret. 7 years ago, Augustine was a desperate scholarship student, fueled by hunger and the frantic need to perfect a revolutionary engine design. He had been broke, chasing investors who looked through him as if he were invisible. In the middle of that storm, Florence, his longtime girlfriend and only anchor, had whispered the words that should have been a blessing but felt like a death sentence to his dreams. She was pregnant. Panic had overridden love. He remembered the coldness in his own voice as he shouted at her, calling the life inside her a distraction he couldn't afford. He had handed her a stack of cash, the last of his savings, and told her to erase the mistake before walking away to pitch the invention that would eventually make him a king. He had chosen his career over her, and though he searched for her once the money started rolling in, she had vanished like smoke in the wind. As he prepared to inspect a new plot at Silverline Junction, the ghost of the man he used to be whispered that some debts could never be paid in cash. The following morning, the heat at Silverline Junction was already oppressive, thick with the scent of exhaust and roasting corn, but Augustine's mind was cooler, fixed on a singular purpose. He stepped out of the white G-Wagon, his polished shoes crunching on the dusty earth as he scanned the chaos of hawkers and commuters. His engineers hovered nearby with site plans, yet Augustine's eyes ignored the landmarks of his future office building, searching instead for a small figure in a tattered gown. He found her tucked into a corner, seated behind a cracked plastic bowl with her chin held high, watching the world with the weary authority of a retired landlady. The moment Anna saw him, her face flashed with a brief spark of recognition before hardening into practiced suspicion. She folded her arms tightly across her chest, blocking his path with a defiant scowl. "You again, mister?" she asked, her voice sharp enough to cut through the noise of the traffic. She accused him of being a kidnap risk, and warned him that he was blocking her potential clients with his rich man face. Augustine found himself suppressed by a laugh, charmed by the sheer audacity of a 7-year-old who spoke of bills to pay and working hours, as if she were a seasoned CEO of the streets. When he asked why she wasn't in school, she scoffed, dismissing ABC talk as unrealistic when there was money to be made. She lamented the 94,000 naira he had wasted on the egg woman the day before, telling him he behaved like he plucked money from a banana tree. In her sharp wit and stubborn pride, Augustine saw a reflection of a spirit he had long forgotten, a resilience that didn't just survive the slum but commanded it. As she marched off into the crowd, warning him not to block her road again, Augustine knew he couldn't let her vanish. The obsession had taken root in Augustine's mind, a relentless fever that no boardroom meeting or multi-billion naira deal could cool. For 7 days, he had paced the Italian marble floors of his office, the image of the sharp-tongued Anna etched behind his eyelids. He could still feel the phantom weight of her small hands gripping his waist, her voice calling him daddy echoing like a long-lost prayer through his hollow hallways. Unable to find peace, Augustine had summoned his most discreet private investigator with a singular sharp command: find that girl and uncover everything. He needed to know if the fire in her eyes was a reflection of the flame he had extinguished in Florence years ago. The call finally came as the sun began to bleed a bruised purple into the Lagos horizon. The investigator's voice was clinical, yet the reality it painted was devastating. They had tracked Anna to the inner depths of a slum off Old Church Road, a place of rusted zinc and broken dreams where the wealthy never ventured. There was no man in the picture, only a mother who neighbors whispered was being eaten away by a mysterious, untreated sickness. While other children were in school, Anna was the one moving through the streets, her hustle at Silverline Junction being the only thing keeping their fragile world from collapsing. Augustine's heart clenched with a physical pain his billions could not numb. The small madam wasn't just a witty child. She was a warrior fighting a war he had started the moment he walked away. Without hesitating, he stripped off his expensive blazer, discarded his security detail, and prepared to enter the trenches of his past. He was going to find them, not as a billionaire, but as a man desperate to see if any spark of the life he once rejected still remained in that narrow, shadow-filled street. The narrow, winding street of the slum was a world away from the manicured lawns of Augustine's estate, smelling of wood smoke and stagnant water. Augustine stepped carefully over broken gutters, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way that no board meeting could ever provoke. He followed the investigator toward a weather-worn door where the paint peeled away like dead skin, revealing deep cracks in the structure of the house. For a billionaire who owned skyscrapers, the modesty of this dwelling was a physical blow to his conscience. He stood at the wooden threshold for a long moment, hesitating before he finally knocked, a soft, uncertain sound that seemed too quiet for the heavy silence of the street. "Who is it?" A voice drifted from within, thin and strained. The door creaked open, and Augustine froze as a woman stepped out, adjusting a faded scarf on her head. She was leaner than the girl he remembered, her cheekbones sharp and her eyes clouded with an exhaustion that reached deep into her soul. But the moment her gaze met his, the years of separation dissolved. "Florence," he whispered, the name tasting like ash and old regret. She stood still as a statue, her eyes widening as if a ghost had materialized from the humid afternoon air. "Augustine," she breathed, her voice barely a tremor. Time paused, the noise of the bustling market at the junction fading into nothingness as a decade of unspoken pain washed over them. Before a single word of explanation could be offered, Florence's eyes rolled back. Her legs buckled beneath her, and she swayed like a reed in the wind. Augustine lunged forward, his powerful arms catching her just before she hit the hard ground, his heart shattering as he realized how little she actually weighed. The sterile, white corridors of the private hospital felt like a cage to Augustine as he paced outside the emergency ward, the rhythmic squeak of his loafers against the linoleum floor marking the seconds of his penance. He had moved Florence into a quiet private suite with soft yellow walls and the steady haunting beep of monitoring machines. When the lead doctor finally emerged, his expression was a mask of professional gravity that made Augustine's heart hammer against his ribs. The news was a cold blade to his conscience. Florence was suffering from intestinal cancer. While the doctor noted it was an early, treatable stage, the true horror lay in the secondary diagnosis of severe malnutrition and systemic exhaustion. Her body was failing not just because of the disease, but because she had spent years starving herself to ensure Anna never missed a meal. Augustine felt the air leave his lungs as he realized the depth of the despair his abandonment had birthed. While he was dining in five-star restaurants and flying across oceans, the woman he once loved was wasting away in a shack, sacrificing her health to raise the child he had called a mistake. "Do everything," Augustine commanded, his voice low and vibrating with a mixture of authority and desperation. He vowed that the best medications and the finest specialists would be at her disposal, regardless of the cost. Entering her room, he looked at her pale, frail face and realized that his billions were useless against the years of pain etched into her tired eyes. He sat by her bed in the heavy silence, finally understanding that the distraction he had run from 7 years ago was the only thing that could ever truly make him whole. The sterile scent of the private ward felt heavy as Augustine knelt by the bed, his expensive trousers gathering dust on the hospital floor. Florence looked away, her face pale against the yellow walls, her silence a sharp blade that cut through his billionaire's confidence. For years, Augustine had commanded boardrooms and dictated the flow of markets, but in this small room, he felt like the terrified scholarship student he had once been. He reached out to touch her hand, his voice cracking as the weight of his secret finally broke. He confessed the truth he had buried under stacks of gold, that he had never stopped regretting the day he chose a prototype engine over their future, and that seeing Anna's eyes at the junction had felt like a second chance he didn't deserve. Anna stood by the doorway, her small frame casting a long shadow as she listened to the man she had called her fake daddy weep. Her sharp-witted tongue, usually ready with a joke about 100,000 naira eggs or banana trees, was suddenly still. She walked slowly toward the bed, her eyes wide with a realization that shifted her entire world. The man in the clean white suit, the one who had protected her from the market woman and brought her mother the best doctors, wasn't just a rich stranger. He was the superhero she had invented stories about to stop her classmates from laughing. Augustine turned to her, tears blurring his vision as he looked at the daughter he had once called a distraction. He didn't offer her toys or a swimming pool this time. He offered a broken apology. He begged Anna for the chance to be more than a bank account, to be the father he should have been 7 years ago. Anna tilted her head, watching him with a wisdom far beyond her years, before reaching out a small hand to wipe a tear from his face, signaling the start of a trial he was determined to pass. The sterile silence of the private hospital ward was broken by the sharp sound of Anna folding her arms across her chest, a gesture of authority that looked strikingly similar to the way Augustine stood in boardrooms. Florence watched from the pillows, her face pale but her eyes burning with a weary protective fire as Augustine knelt on the cold tiles to meet his daughter's gaze. He was a man who commanded thousands, yet he looked small beneath the judgment of a 7-year-old in a hospital gown. Anna tilted her head, her expression shifting from suspicion to a cold, calculated pragmatism. She declared that since he claimed to be her father, he would have to earn the title through a strict 3-month probation period. If he misbehaved, if he made her mother cry, or if he showed any of the selfishness that had defined his past, they would sweep him out of their lives like a broken broomstick. Augustine didn't argue. He merely nodded, accepting the terms of his sentence with a humility that surprised even himself. Anna pulled out a small, tattered notebook, insisting that every act of kindness and every moment of presence would be recorded and scrutinized. She demanded to know if he was prepared to trade his boardrooms for school runs and his business dinners for grocery trips, emphasizing that a rich face alone would not buy her loyalty. Florence remained silent, her heart a battlefield of old pain and new hope, watching as the billionaire engineer agreed to the most difficult contract of his life. The probation had begun, and as Anna narrowed her eyes to check his sincerity, Augustine realized that for the first time in his life, his billions were useless. Only his character would determine if he remained a father or returned to being a ghost. The transition from the rusted zinc rooftops of the slum to the marble floors of Augustine's mansion was a dizzying shift that Anna embraced with open wonder, but for Florence, every gilded corner felt like a gilded cage. Though she had agreed to move in for the sake of Anna's health and education, She remained stiff and guarded, treating Augustine's sudden generosity as a debt she never intended to owe. She refused to touch the allowance he set aside or the designer clothes he filled her wardrobe with, choosing instead to wear her old, faded wrappers as a shield for her pride. To Augustine's utter confusion, Florence did not spend her days lounging by the massive swimming pool or watching the big-screen television that captivated their daughter. Instead, as soon as she was strong enough to stand without swaying, she sought out work that was entirely her own. She flatly rejected Augustine's offer of a high-paying executive position at one of his engineering firms, telling him through tight lips that she would not be a charity case in his empire. She eventually secured a job as a waitress at a local diner far from the wealthy suburbs. Every morning, while Augustine took Anna to school in the white G-Wagon, Florence took the public bus to work, spending long hours on her feet serving coffee and cleaning tables for a meager wage. Augustine watched her from a distance, his heart heavy with a mixture of frustration and deepening respect. He tried to intervene, bringing her expensive shoes to replace her worn work flats, but she returned them without a word. He realized then that while his billions could buy the best doctors in the country, they could not buy back the dignity he had stripped away 7 years ago. He would have to endure the bad eyes she gave him and wait for her pride to heal on its own terms. The golden glow of the late afternoon sun bathed Augustine's private garden as he stood before Florence, his shadow long and humbled on the manicured grass. The months of probation had stripped away the billionaire's armor, leaving behind a man who finally understood that his massive branch offices and offshore accounts were nothing compared to the quiet rhythm of a shared home. Holding Florence's hands, the same hands that had worked as a waitress to keep her pride intact, Augustine dropped to his knees. There was no audience, no cameras, and no engineering team to impress. There was only a decade of regret and a plea for a future he didn't deserve. He whispered a final broken apology for the day he chose a prototype over her heart, and this time when Florence looked at him, the bad eye was gone, replaced by a tearful, radiant smile as she finally said yes. Their wedding was a small, emotional ceremony that felt more like a sanctuary than a social event. Augustine looked at Florence, who had recovered her strength and beauty after the surgery he had insisted on providing. But the true star of the day was Anna, the small madam who had traded her tattered market clothes for a white lace dress that made her look like a tiny queen. As the flower girl, she didn't just walk down the aisle, she marched with her chin high, tossing petals like she was inspecting a new estate. True to her nature, she interrupted the vows to remind Augustine that the 3-month probation was officially over and that he was now hired for life. Laughter rippled through the guests as Augustine and Florence shared a kiss, sealing a bond that turned an empty empire into a living legacy of healing.